this morning before probably, hopefully, a nice Easter weekend coming up ahead. Um, so today we wanted to go through spring burn-off agronomics. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Michelle Thompson. I'm the market development agronomist for Balcarres, Raymore, and Wynyard. And just to let you all know that I will be taking off on mat leave as of May 7th, and Chanel Sherby will be filling in for me for the 12-month period I'm gone. So stay tuned for her reaching out to you, and I'll be handing my phone over to her end of April here, and she'll be taking care of you all this season, and I wish you all the best. So for questions, feel free to use the chat box. I can see it, which is awesome. Or otherwise, text my number there, and I'll try to get to it. Or just unmute yourself and fire away during the presentation, and we'll try and get to as many questions as possible. So yeah, I will be recording this, so if you get cut off or have to take off and do something else but would like a copy, please let us know. And we are giving away 80 acres of Volterra Easy, so please make sure we know you attended. If you don't have your full name as your attendee name, please let us know you were on, and we'll get your name in for the draw for that. And we'll be dropping that off pretty quick here as we jump into spring. And with that, let's get into it. All right, so today the goal was just to go through the spring burn-off agronomics, and with that, talking about spraying conditions, definitely talking about low temperatures in the spring and when should we be spraying, specific weed timings, what weeds are we targeting, and when should we be targeting them at. And then going through briefly some product options, just because there are a lot of options out there, so didn't want to spend too much time on it, but at least talk briefly on some specific options that I really like or that we've seen good results with. So before we begin, I want to go through the weed-free period. So the reason we talk about pre-burn is because we know how important it is to control weeds when they're small. We know weed pressure reduces yield potential, so the better control we have of those weeds before that crop is established, the better that crop will have for nutrient, moisture, and sunlight potential. And definitely the past couple of years, moisture is something we want to protect. Later on in the season, of course, when we get heavy weed pressure, that can trigger a stress response in the crop. So the crop will actually spend more energy into competing, so putting out bigger, thicker leaves, maybe more tillers, than into reproduction, which is the opposite of what we want. So the goal with an early pre-burn is control when the weeds are controllable, when they're small before they get out of staging, and prevent some irreversible yield loss. For cereals and peas and flax, the reason we talk about the importance of a pre-burn is because that weed-free period where we've seen the most yield damage is actually when the cereals are small. So when those crops are in that smaller emergence timing, they actually are heavily influenced by the weed pressure around them, and that leads into yield loss. So we definitely want to make sure we're putting down a good pre-burn ahead of our cereals and peas, just because that in-crop isn't going in till later. So we want to make sure that field's as clean as possible to hold off that weed pressure and make sure that crop is as healthy as possible. With canola, some of you might be thinking, well, I can go in with my Liberty and Roundup at that cotyledon stage. And that's true, you totally could. But in my thinking, with our heavy canola rotations, what weed are we mostly trying to control in a canola crop? It's the volunteer canola. So going by straight Roundup or straight Liberty, you're going to get a lot of misses that way on the volunteer canola. So it becomes really important to make sure that tank mix option is in that pre-burn so that we can get a jump on volunteer canola before it becomes a problem in crop. And then especially for Clearfield canola, we're not going in with that Aries application until around 2 leaf. So you want to make sure that you keep that canola crop as clean as possible until that point. So a pre-burn ahead of your Clearfield canola is definitely something you want to plan and implement before that crop goes in. And we don't have a lot of lentils, and I'm not going to get into soybeans. Spraying temperatures. So temperatures for best herbicide efficacy. So Roundup definitely is their product of choice, and the best performance temperatures for Roundup is 16 to 24 degrees. When do we ever get that in spring? So we have to settle for some different situations. For pre-burn application, when you're looking at a glyphosate application in a tank mix, we want to wait for at least an 8-degree temperature for 2 hours of the day, meaning that the day has warmed up and you're probably into the afternoon when you're starting to get the heat of the day. And especially when we're adding a tank mix, it becomes really important that you wait till that sun is shining. Now, this doesn't always happen, so you might have to make some sacrifices, but the nicer the day, the better the results are going to be. If weather is cold and wet, obviously our weed growth is reduced and that herbicide isn't going to be taken up effectively by that plant, and you're probably not going to see the responses you're looking for. So best message for the best results, when weeds are healthy and actively growing, that's when you should be spraying. If you think it's a beautiful day out and you want to be outside in it, that probably means you should be spraying. And again, stop me if you guys have any questions. Spraying conditions, so conditions that encourage weed growth. So we're targeting a vast variety of different weed species who have different cycles. So with annuals, they require similar conditions to a newly seeded crop to germinate. So they're waiting for those soils to warm up to an average of 5 degrees, meaning we're looking for probably double-digit daytime temperatures for a couple days or maybe a couple weeks, and our nighttime lows aren't reaching below 0 anymore, and hopefully staying above 0 for quite a while. So our annuals are probably going to be the last thing popping up, and this includes kochia and wild oats. A good example of this, the past couple years, as we know, we've had really cold seeding conditions and cold soils, and it's taken a while for kochia and wild oats to come up, making them a little bit harder to target with a pre-burn. For perennials and winter annuals, they're going to start to perk up when conditions warm up, meaning soils are consistently around 2 degrees, and your daytime highs maybe aren't reaching double digits, but are staying above 0 for at least 3 days. And your nighttime lows are probably not reaching anywhere below 0. So they're going to be the first things popping up, and that's going to include your dandelions, your cleavers, and your Canada thistles, those sort of things. So target weeds, there's lots of different weeds out there, and I've only included a couple of them. If there is a specific weed that's not on here or you're having trouble controlling, please reach out to us and we'll set you up with some tips that hopefully will get you control of that or get you on the right path for a plan to control it over a couple years. So when we're looking at annuals, the biggest ones we're talking about is obviously kochia, volunteer canola, like I mentioned before, wild buckwheat, wild oats, and green foxtail, perennials, dandelions, and Canada thistle, and winter annuals, we've got cleavers and narrowleaf hawksbeard. So technically cleavers and narrowleaf hawksbeards are annuals, but what can happen is if conditions are right in the fall, they can germinate in the fall. And if we get a mild winter with heavy snowfall, they will survive over the winter and be pretty large in the spring, making them a lot tougher to control. So sometimes those winter annuals can be a big issue in the spring. So product options. There's lots of products on the market for glyphosate add-ins. And the reason we talk about glyphosate add-ins is because glyphosate is and has been our favorite product of choice, and it does an amazing job, but it's definitely a tool that we want to keep in our toolbox and we don't want to overuse. And the reason I bring that up is because glyphosate-resistant kochia is on our doorstep, and kochia definitely being one weed that's becoming an issue across our territory. We definitely want to make sure that we don't lose the value of Roundup, and we want to add that tank mix in there to make sure that we can continue to use glyphosate in the future. So there are lots of options out there, and I would say it begins with what are you targeting, and how and what timing you're wanting to go in. So probably most of you are familiar with Conquer. It's a group 14 and 6. It's a really good option if you're looking for basic annual control, just something broad spectrum, and it does offer dandelion suppression. So still a great option if there's not a specific weed concern that you have. If you don't have thick mats of kochia and you don't have overwintered cleavers, Conquer will still do a really good job for you. Prospect is a newer one that came out last year. It's a group 14 and 4. And with that group 4, what we're doing is we're getting annual and winter annual control and then actual dandelion control. And what I love about Prospect is if you do have large overwintered cleavers, Prospect will do an amazing job. It will smoke those cleavers for you that are actually pretty large. So that's where I would really fit Prospect in. And Certitude. This is a newer one from BASF that they released. This season, it will be its first season. So it's a group 6 and 27. So what we're getting with Certitude is basic annual control similar to Conquer, but what we've added with that group 27 is a new group on kochia control. So this would be my product of choice if you are fighting those thick mats of kochia. Personally, I haven't actually seen it, but just based on what we know about the group 27, I'm really excited to see how well it does this year and what it does on that kochia, and I expect it's going to be pretty impressive. So looking at products ahead of the cereals, so there's lots of options ahead of cereals, and I've just narrowed it down to a couple that I think really have a great fit across our territory. Blackhawk, group 14 and 4. So you're going to get your basic annual control, but it actually does a really good job on larger rosettes. I've seen this product take down really large flickweed, and it was pretty impressive. So that would be a go-to product if you're fighting quite a broad spectrum and maybe have a little bit bigger annuals popping up. Probably not your perennial product of choice though. Pre-Pass. Pre-Pass is a popular option. It does a really good job. It's a group 2 and obviously well liked for the extended control of annuals, mostly volunteer canola and cleavers, and that's would be smaller cleavers. The only thing to watch out with Pre-Pass is on its own, it does not have any kochia control. So if you are looking for kochia control, Corex is the way to go. It's a group 2 and 4. So you're combining the power of Pre-Pass with kochia control by adding the dicamba component in with that product. So the reason I talk about Pre-Pass on its own not controlling kochia is glyphosate technically does control kochia. The only concern I have is it's been mediocre control in the past. It's not great. And like I mentioned before, we have seen glyphosate resistant kochia north of our area. So it is something to be aware of just for how fast kochia can spread. So I'd much rather see, if kochia is your concern, not just relying on the glyphosate, but adding a product that does have an active for kochia control, like Corex. Another great option if kochia is your concern, but you really like Express, is Express FX. So group 2 and 4, and it's combining Express SG with kochia control. So again, adding the dicamba component into a well-liked product like Express SG that we know does really well on dandelions and has that residual volunteer canola control. And the last product I wanted to mention is Olympus. So we talked about broadleaves, but maybe we haven't talked about the grass control. Olympus will bump up your glyphosate control on grasses, especially on foxtail barley and green foxtail, and then also giving you some volunteer canola control. I've seen this product do a smoking job on heavy foxtail barley and green foxtail. So if those are weeds of concern, this would be a product to look at. On the wild oat side, it does add suppression. If you have really heavy wild oats, I would still recommend looking at something like maybe an Avidex or a Focus. But that being said, it still will help with the wild oat control, but definitely more of a foxtail barley and green foxtail play with the Olympus. And last but not least, we've got our pulses. So Authority is a well-loved brand. It's been around for a while. Group 14, and we know we're getting that extended kochia control, which is great. And one of the limited products that actually does provide extended kochia control. So this has definitely been a go-to product, especially on the flax acres for quite a while. Only registered ahead of peas, do not put ahead of lentils. Volterra, which we're giving away today, is a group 14. And with that product, what we're getting is extended dandelion control, which is something new. And then you're also going to have, you're also going to have some kochia control and volunteer canola suppression. So an interesting product. It does require a little bit of moisture to activate, but what you're creating is a layer where those weeds grow through that layer, and you're controlling that weed before it can even get established. And last but not least is Goldwing. I really like Goldwing as if you're battling kind of a broad spectrum of annuals and don't want to be relying on some moisture activation, Goldwing is the best product to go with. Group 14 and 4, it's going to give you a broad spectrum of annual control, and yeah, you're not going to be relying on any moisture activation to use this product. So really great option. Maybe as we get into a season where it might be drier, you're still going to be happy with the results you get with Goldwing without that moisture activation. Any questions on products or products I didn't mention that you're curious about? Don't be shy.
Anything for night flowering catch fly that's good on it?
Yeah, for night flowering catch fly, Catlin, honestly, your expresses are the way to go. Those will do a really good job just with the tribenuron and the components in the Express SG and Express Pro. But again, if you're still battling with kochia, I would look at Express FX. Blackhawk might have like top growth suppression. If they're smaller, it might do an okay job of holding it back just with the 2,4-D component in the Blackhawk. So those would be a couple options there.
Thank you.
And before I wrap it up, of course, what would be a presentation on spraying if we didn't talk about water volumes? So is more water better? And this is always a question I get in the spring, actually probably all year. I understand the convenience it is to go at 5 gallons and the commitment it takes to increase that water volume. So I stole this chart from Sprayers 101. And that is a website run by Tom Wolf. Hopefully you're familiar with him. He has dedicated his life to understanding water and nozzles and the impact that they have on spraying and herbicide efficacy. So from going through this chart, you need to consider what products are in the tank, and that will impact your water volume and also what type of nozzles you should be using. In general, I'm a fan of that 7-gallon, just because, especially if you're using products like Conquer, where it's completely contact, I've seen really poor results at 5 gallons on if you're trying to battle a thick mat of kochia at that 5 gallons with Conquer. By increasing that water volume to at least 7 and hopefully 10 with a contact product, you're just going to get better coverage and see better results. That being said, there are products that do still do a good job at 5 gallons, but again, sometimes that 7-gallon rate is just going to get that droplet down to the ground where it needs to be versus relying on the right nozzle size to get it there. And sometimes it depends on your targets, right? How big are your weeds when you're spraying, and maybe what are the conditions when you're spraying? So there's lots of factors, and more isn't always better, but maybe less isn't best either. From the chart here, you can kind of see that 7-gallon is kind of a good range, and going with some coarser nozzles might be the way to go. Then you're making sure that you're getting droplets right down to the ground and hitting those smaller targets versus when you're going with your in-crop and trying to get just that top broadleaf. So there's a lot to consider. Your basic spraying principles. Spray must reach the target. So like I said, you want that droplet size to get where it needs to go. You need to have enough droplets to cover the target. So you don't want just one big drop sitting on a leaf that falls off, or you don't want a bunch of small droplets that just end up evaporating. And then droplet size and pesticide concentration must be efficient to be taken up by the target. So in a situation with herbicides, probably 15 gallons is unnecessary because you're going to reduce that pesticide concentration and you're not going to see the results you need. Whereas with a fungicide, you definitely want to increase that fungicide or that water volume to at least 15, and you're still going to be happy with the concentration, but it's going to produce droplet sizes that are going to penetrate that thick canopy. So just something to be aware of. There's no right answer, but like I said, I'm a huge fan of that 7-gallon. It's kind of a happy medium, and going with a coarser nozzle. So that's all I had today. I just wanted to keep it short and sweet. Again, if please make sure we know you attended today, and we'll get your name in to win some Volterra. And yeah, if you have any questions, please let us know. And if there's any other weed concerns you have, let us know, and we'll set you up for some success with controlling that. Yes, Mark?
So we call it a pre-burn. How far ahead should we be spraying these products? 24 hours, 2 days, day after we seed?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm a huge fan of at least a day ahead of seeding, because you want to give that plant time to take in that chemistry before you're uprooting it with your drill. And then your post-seeding will be determined by the products. Some products you are safe to apply up to 3 days after seeding. Some they recommend only a day. But if you can go farther after seeding, it's probably better, because that's going to give those weeds time to recoup after being uprooted and start to grow again. You also need to consider is what's emerged at the time, right? Sometimes you need to go closer to seeding just because the field might be pretty clean if you're wanting to go early. But if you are able to go that week ahead and things are actively growing, then please do that. Go that week ahead and start getting your acres done before the push is on to get the drills in the ground. Good question. Anything else? If not, I will wrap this up and let you all go. Thanks again for joining us and have a great Easter, everyone.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.